The scent of spiced wine and bay laurel choked the general's villa. General Valerius Claudius, granite-faced and victorious, raised his cup to his new silent wife Lyra, who stood pale and beautiful. Suddenly, a small, linen-clad boy, scurrying away after pouring a splash of Falernian, stopped and looked directly at the general. "The wine is sweet, General," the boy whispered, his eyes wide with fear. "But the bride just whispered the name of your slain enemy." Valerius's hand froze mid-air, the sound of the flutes seeming to dull instantly. Lyra's eyes, fixed on him, held no celebration, only a deep, desolate terror. He had bought peace with this marriage, but he realized instantly he had purchased a bomb. General Valerius Claudius stood like a column carved from the marble of the Palatine Hill, his polished bronze cuirass gleaming under the midday sun, filtering into his private study. The wedding celebrations had been concluded hastily, the political requirement satisfied. Now the routine demanded authority. A courier knelt before him, delivering reports from the distant Rhine frontier. Valerius did not touch the parchment immediately. He observed the seal, the tightness of the binding, confirming the meticulous, unyielding order he imposed on his world. He was the shield of Rome, the man who had crushed the last great Gallic uprising, and his name was synonymous with brutal efficiency. His reputation was his armor. Every morning he began with inspection, not of troops, but of his own reflection. He searched for any sign of weakness, any hint of the ghost that sometimes haunted his periphery. He was 45, and the years of campaigning had etched deep lines around his mouth, lines that spoke of strategic withdrawals and necessary slaughters. Today his image was flawless, the embodiment of gravitas and unshakable virtus. Valerius signed the orders for troop deployment, his quill scratching a decisive mark against the heavy paper. The courier accepted the scroll and backed away, not daring to look up. This was the performance of power, a silent, absolute decree. Yet, as the man disappeared, the general's gaze drifted to a small worn wooden token sitting amidst the gold-inlaid military maps. This token was the only thing remaining of his son Marcus, lost 5 years ago during a minor skirmish in Britannia, a campaign Valerius had himself commanded but failed to supervise directly. He had pushed Marcus too hard, demanding perfection, demanding the legacy of Rome be carried without flaw. Marcus had perished not grandly, but pointlessly, drowned trying to cross a freezing river after a poorly planned flanking maneuver. Valerius had ordered 1,000 men to die since then, but Marcus's death was the wound that would not close. The immense power Valerius wielded was merely a tool to punish the chaos that had claimed his son. He had married Lyra, a captured noblewoman from the recently subdued Celtic tribes, purely to solidify the uneasy peace, a transaction of absolute political necessity. Lyra, silent, beautiful, and utterly devoid of Latin, was simply another strategic asset. He touched the worn wood, feeling the sharp, agonizing failure. He had given Rome everything, including the future he had groomed. But the peace he had bought with Lyra felt brittle, sharp, and cheap. He needed order. But the boy's whispered sentence during the ceremony had introduced pure disorder into his structured life. The bride just whispered the name of your slain enemy. The slain enemy was Vercingetorix, the Celtic chieftain whose head Valerius had personally presented to the Senate. If Lyra had spoken his name, it meant not only treason, but that the perfect, silent hostage he had taken was far more dangerous than he could comprehend. The silence in his study suddenly felt thick, oppressive. The only sound was the distant, hollow echo of the city, a sound that Valerius suddenly heard as a threat. Lucius was not a soldier, a senator, or even a freedman. He was a pister, a baker, who served the general's vast household, rising before the sun to feed the insatiable appetite of Roman power. His hands, perpetually dusted with flour, were scarred and calloused, evidence of 18 hours spent daily bending over the roaring brick ovens. His world was defined by heat, weight, and the precise timing of fermentation. Visibility was his enemy. He preferred the anonymity of the servants' quarters and the deep shadows of the scullery. Lucius was small, thin from constant toil, his eyes perpetually red from the smoke. His greatest limitation was his tongue. He stuttered badly when under pressure, making conversation a constant, low-level dread. He had witnessed the general's wedding feast, but only from the humid, crowded passage where he coordinated the endless supply of bread loaves. He was terrified of the general, as all low servants were, but his fear was secondary to the fierce, protective instinct he held for his younger sister, Ilara. Ilara was 5, a quiet girl who spent her days trailing the kitchen staff, too small yet to be assigned a task, but old enough to be constantly vulnerable in the ruthless Roman hierarchy. Lucius worked, endured, and stayed silent for her. His only hope was to save enough copper to buy them both freedom someday, a distant dream that kept him lifting the heavy sacks of grain every dawn. It was Ilara who had been placed briefly by a careless slave overseer near the general's table during the toasts. She was the one who had offered the splash of wine, and it was Ilara who had heard the strange guttural sounds coming from the beautiful new bride, Lyra, when the cheers were loudest. Lucius had pulled Ilara back instantly, scrubbing the wine stain from her tunic, chastising her in hurried, silent gestures. But Ilara, protected by her childhood innocence, had repeated the sounds to Lucius later, mimicking the cadence perfectly, while Lucius kneaded dough in the pre-dawn quiet. Lucius recognized the language instantly. It wasn't the coarse dialect of the local slaves, it was the ancient, forbidden tongue of the conquered Gauls, the dialect his own mother had sometimes sung lullabies in, a dialect thought extinguished in this city. Lyra, the silent bride, had spoken the name of Vercingetorix, the dead chieftain. Lucius hadn't needed the little cupbearer's confirmation. He already knew. Lyra was not merely a trophy, she was an active, breathing connection to Rome's greatest enemy. The general thought he had married peace. Lucius knew he had married a knife. He understood the danger of this knowledge. It was a death sentence if whispered to the wrong ear, but the truth gnawed at him. He knew Lyra was in grave peril, and Rome's order was built upon a lie of silence. Where are you watching from today, my friends? The massive General Valerius Claudius often moved through his own villa like a shadow, unexpected and silent, observing the perfection of the machinery he owned. He was making his late-night rounds not for vigilance, but for distraction. Sleep rarely came easily, leaving him wandering the vast, chill corridors. He was still processing the boy's whisper, the seed of doubt planted at the very heart of his achievement. He could not interrogate Lyra. Any open inquiry into her loyalty would shatter the fragile political alliance and make him look foolish, even weak, before the Senate. He moved toward the kitchens, drawn by the smell of wood smoke and fresh baking, the scent of industry and simple reality, which felt cleaner than the perfumed halls above. Lucius was finishing the last batch of bread for the morning patrols. He was slumped on a stool near the glowing mouth of the oven, exhausted. He was so focused on calculating the weight of the day's flour ration that he didn't hear the soft scrape of the general's leather sandals until Valerius was directly in the entryway. Valerius paused. He saw the baker, a wisp of a man, covered in white dust, leaning forward in pure fatigue. He was insignificant, yet Valerius noticed the intensity in the baker's eyes, even in rest. They were sharp, almost predatory, but dimmed by fear, a familiar sight to the general, a look he had seen in defeated barbarians facing the executioner's axe. Valerius did not speak. He merely watched Lucius for a moment, recognizing the sheer, brutal consistency of labor. The general who mastered armies respected total dedication to a craft, even if that craft was bread. Lucius felt the presence before he saw the shadow. His breath caught, triggering the tightening in his throat that always preceded his stutter. He scrambled to his feet, knocking the empty flour basket. The sound echoed loudly in the cavernous kitchen. Lucius instantly dropped into a deep, subservient bow, his head pressed low to avoid the general's gaze. Valerius took a deep, measured breath, the aroma of yeast and grain filling his lungs. It was an honest smell. He simply nodded, a minuscule, dismissive gesture, and turned away, heading back toward the silence of his sleeping quarters. But as he passed, Lucius risked a single, quick upward glance. He saw the general's profile, the tension in his jaw, the deep fatigue that mirrored his own, and the flash of something wounded in the general's distant eyes. It wasn't the look of a god. It was the look of a man struggling to hold a heavy burden, and in that brief, terrifying instant, Lucius connected the general's visible fatigue to the impossible burden of the secret Lyra carried. He realized the destruction that lay ahead would not spare the general, the silent bride, or the invisible baker. The weight of the world they shared had just become dangerously unstable, balanced precariously on a lie. The strange tranquility of the general's villa fractured slowly, imperceptibly, except to Lucius. Every morning, the baker saw the general's bride, Lyra, as she descended to the courtyard to watch the morning ritual of the legionaries' training drill. Lyra was never meant to be watched, but Lucius was always near, loading the military rations onto the mule carts. To the guards and household staff, Lyra was a picture of silent, defeated beauty. She was cloaked and veiled, adhering to Roman standards of modesty, showing no emotion, accepting the transition from chieftain's daughter to Roman wife with cold compliance. Everyone saw a hostage resigned to her fate. Lucius saw something else entirely. He noticed the small, nearly invisible habits. Lyra rarely ate the elaborate Roman breakfast. She only drank the water from the fountains near the training yard. And Lucius noticed which fountain. It was the one fed by a single dark marble spout, intricately carved with the head of a predatory bird, placed specifically by the general to symbolize Rome's dominance. The first time Lucius dismissed it. The second, he marked it. By the third day, as Lyra stood by the basin, her elegant hand hovering over the dark water, Lucius watched her closely. She did not merely drink. She used the reflective surface of the water, framed by the dark marble, as a mirror. But she wasn't checking her veil. She was watching the guards. It wasn't a defiant stare. It was the intense, calculated observation of a hunter mapping the territory. Her eyes tracked the rotation of the cohorts, the shift changes, the precise timing of the patrols. The Roman soldiers saw a bored woman staring at water. Lucius saw a strategist memorizing the pattern of their lives. But the most disturbing detail was the bread. Valerius had ordered that the finest white wheaten bread be served to his bride, a mark of status. Lyra consistently broke off a small piece, a crust, and placed it inside a fold of her cloak before leaving the table, untouched. Lucius knew the fine dining halls were obsessed with waste, but no one dared question the general's new wife. One afternoon, Lucius saw Lyra slip away briefly into the vast, overgrown section of the garden. He followed her silently, driven by a growing, sickening curiosity. Hidden beneath a ruined archway, where the old stone marked the general's property line, Lyra knelt. She pulled the piece of bread from her cloak. She crumbled it precisely, scattering the white crumbs around the base of the stone arch. It was not an offering. It was a marker, a sign visible only to one who knew what to look for, a trail leading away from the general's secure villa toward the unsettled territory beyond the city walls. Lucius felt the icy grip of fear. This was not the act of a grieving widow. This was the methodical, quiet preparation of an operative. She was not resigned. She was reporting. Lyra was communicating the layout, the weaknesses, the timing to someone outside the gates. Lucius's initial fear of speaking the truth was suddenly eclipsed by the terror of being complicit in what felt like looming political catastrophe. He stood rigid in the shadows, realizing he was the only witness to the war being waged in silence within the general's walls. The weight of the secret became intolerable, crushing Lucius's sleep and appetite. He saw Lyra's quiet nightly movement towards the garden arch as the winding of a slow-moving clock toward disaster. He knew his silence was protection for Ilara, but his silence was also a shield for treason. If Rome fell to chaos, who would protect the vulnerable? He needed to expose the truth, but the direct approach was impossible. A stuttering baker denouncing the general's bride would be dismissed, tortured, or executed for slander before he finished the first sentence. He needed proof that the general could not ignore, a truth delivered by the general's own meticulous hand. The general, an obsessive man of order, insisted that every piece of official correspondence, especially those concerning frontier intelligence and troop movements, be sealed with his personal, unique signet ring, applied with a specific black wax. Valerius kept the ring on his bedside table every night, a symbol of his unbreakable command. That evening, Lucius waited until the villa fell into the deep, heavy quiet of the pre-dawn hours. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He moved through the passages, the familiar scent of expensive oil lamps and old stone doing little to calm his nerves. He reached the private wing, an area forbidden to all but the highest-ranking slaves. He had no intention of stealing the ring, only of borrowing its mark. He slipped into the massive, echoing bedroom. The air felt thick with Valerius's demanding presence, even in sleep. Lucius could hear the general's deep, steady breathing. Valerius was not a man who slept lightly. Lucius moved to the bedside table, his fingers trembling, brushing against the cold bronze of the ring. In his other hand, Lucius held a small, delicate clay tablet, one usually used for household inventories. He pressed the soft, warm clay quickly and cleanly against the black wax remaining on the general's ring stand, capturing the intricate, unique impression. It was done in seconds. He backed away, agonizingly slowly, holding the soft clay close to his chest. He returned to the kitchen, his body slick with terror sweat. He baked his first batch of loaves, but these were not for consumption. He pressed the small clay tablet, now hardened, deep into the core of one of the loaves, a large regulation-issue military bread intended for the general's personal inspection. Later that morning, during the formal presentation of the daily household supplies, Lucius knelt before the steward, presenting the tray. The steward, impatient and bored, checked the bread. Lucius's eyes, fixed on the steward's face, pleaded silently. The steward, annoyed by the unusual size of one specific loaf, picked it up, feeling the unnatural weight. He hesitated, looking at Lucius. Lucius knew he had reached the point of no return. He had to speak. He forced the sound out, the fear ripping through his throat. Sir, to the general, he said, to check the weight of this loaf. Personally, for the seal. It was an audacious lie, referencing the general's legendary fixation on precision. The steward, instantly intimidated by the idea of displeasing Valerius, put the bread aside. Take this directly to the general's morning table. Tell him the pistor sends the day's inspection loaf. The story had just pivoted. Lucius, the invisible baker, had forced his way into the highest room of Rome's power structure. The heavy loaf of bread sat incongruously beside Valerius's polished silver cup during his morning strategy session. He frowned, irritated by the interruption. The steward's explanation, relayed by a trembling slave, was vague. Something about the baker claiming the general requested a weight inspection. Valerius despised such unnecessary displays. "Dismiss the baker," Valerius commanded, his voice sharp, "and find me a steward who understands priorities." He was about to brush the bread onto the floor when his military advisor, Decimus, a pragmatic man of meticulous habit, picked up the loaf. "General, with respect, this bread is dense. Too dense. It feels weighted." Valerius watched, impatient, as Decimus snapped the military-grade loaf in half. The baked clay tablet fell onto the marble floor with a quiet, hard clatter. Silence seized the room. Valerius stared at the small, mundane object. It was undeniably clay, baked hard inside his bread. He picked it up, expecting a message, a threat, perhaps a childish game. He saw the impression. His breath hitched. It was the perfect, unmistakable negative imprint of his signet ring. The specific flaws, the minute carvings, the mark only he used. Valerius gripped the clay so tightly his knuckles turned white. No one should have access to that mark, least of all a baker, and certainly not the clay required to press it. The weight of the implication was immediate and immense. This was not a random theft. This was evidence presented with suicidal bravery. Someone knew something, and had been forced to speak in a language the general could not ignore, the language of absolute, verified proof of access. "Find the baker," Valerius ordered, his voice dangerously low. "Do not harm him. Bring him to my private chambers now and double the guard on the northern wall immediately, quietly. I want no alarm raised, Decimus, not a single breath." Valerius did not wait. He stormed toward his quarters. The game was no longer theoretical. Someone in his house was compromised, and the baker had risked everything to show him how. The question was, What was the signet ring impression proof of? Not of the baker's treason, but of his own weakness. Who in his household was utilizing the symbol of his authority? He found the answer before the baker arrived. Valerius had ordered the destruction of a specific batch of diplomatic correspondence, sensitive data regarding troop numbers and the path of the imperial road, which was to be sent to a distant governor tomorrow. He checked his private desk. The scrolls were still there, bound and sealed with his wax. He snatched them up and examined the black wax seals. They were flawless, his ring's mark perfectly imprinted, but Valerius was a master of detail. He looked closer, comparing the tiny imperfection on the ring face with the seal on the scrolls. The marks matched exactly, but the wax was cold stiff. It hadn't been applied this morning. A horrifying realization hit him. The baker wasn't proving that someone had stolen his ring. He was proving that someone had copied his seal impression, likely yesterday, while the documents were awaiting transport, using the stolen proof of identity to perhaps swap the true scrolls for forged ones, or even worse, to send out unsanctioned orders under his name. The chaos Lucius had warned of was already here, hiding behind his own seal of authority. His immediate family, his staff, his perfect order, it was all a mask. Valerius did not wait for Lucius. He went straight to Lyra's private apartment, throwing open the ornate doors without ceremony. Lyra was standing by the window, braiding her dark hair with a simple copper band. She turned, her expression one of practiced neutrality, the perfect conquered princess. "General," she said, her voice soft, foreign. She spoke only the necessary words in heavily accented poor Latin, maintaining the illusion of linguistic inability. Valerius strode into the room, tossing the clay tablet onto the floor near her feet. It broke into 2 sharp pieces. "Vercingetorix," he said, his voice a low, lethal vibration. "The name you whispered at the wedding. Now tell me what other language you speak, wife." Lyra did not flinch, but the neutral mask shattered. Her eyes, suddenly sharp and filled with ancient resolve, betrayed her. She did not look at the broken clay. She looked at Valerius with cold understanding. "My name is Lyra, daughter of Arian," she corrected him, her Latin suddenly perfect, fluent and biting. "The language I speak is the truth that Rome refuses to hear." Valerius felt the floor shift beneath him. This was not the mute hostage he had purchased. "The copper band in your hair, it is a signal, the bread you scatter. A map. You are communicating with the remnants of the Gallic clans. Are you trading my troop movements under my seal?" Lyra's lip curled in contempt. "Your seal? I found your vanity, General. I found your obsession with the perfect impression. I found a slave willing to be paid for access to your study. I am not trading troop movements. I am providing a way for my people to retrieve a sacred object stolen by your legions after the fall of Vercingetorix." "A sacred object? You risk war for a statue," Valerius scoffed, though he recognized the profound significance of such relics to the tribes. "Not a statue," Lyra spat. "His journals, Vercingetorix's history, written by his own hand. If those journals are published by Rome, they will turn my people into monsters in the eyes of the world. They will justify every cruelty you commit. If they are retrieved, they will simply become memory." She stepped toward him, abandoning all pretense of fear. "You took my land, General. You took my freedom. You took my language. And then you tried to silence the history of my father's struggle. You thought I was a mute object of peace. I am not peace, Valerius. I am duty." Valerius stared at her, the political truth of his marriage collapsing into a devastating personal confrontation. He hadn't married a symbol of surrender. He had married the living embodiment of rebellion, cloaked in perfect subservience. She had mastered Roman etiquette, Roman law, and Roman vanity, all to execute her mission. The wound of his son's loss suddenly felt insignificant compared to the active present treason flourishing in his own house. He realized the severity of the situation. Her contacts, whoever they were, would soon cross the general's boundary line to search for the journals. He had to stop the retrieval, not just to protect the documents, but to protect Lyra from the inevitable execution for treason, a fate he suddenly found unbearable for the woman who spoke truth in the language of the enemy. The urgency in Valerius's actions was cold and immediate. He knew Lyra's accomplices would be moving tonight, following the trail of crumbs and the pattern of the guard shifts she had mapped. He could not expose her without facing public humiliation and the total collapse of the fragile peace treaty. Yet he could not allow the journals, documents that fueled Roman propaganda, to be stolen. He summoned Decimus, his advisor, and Lucius, the baker, simultaneously. Lucius was ushered in, pale and shaking, expecting the worst. Valerius gave him a single, harsh command. "Tell me where the bread markers lead. Show me the specific archway, Lucius. Now." Lucius, seeing the depth of the general's realization, suddenly found his voice. He led Valerius and a small trusted contingent of guards through the villa's labyrinthine gardens, pointing silently to the boundary stone where the pieces of bread had marked the infiltration point. Valerius acted swiftly. He ordered the ambush, placing his best centurions, men loyal only to him, near the archway. The confrontation was brutally silent, carried out far from the main villa. 2 men, Gallic tribesmen disguised as simple farmers, lost their lives in the struggle. No one was captured. Valerius wanted no witnesses, no confessions, no trace that his own wife had orchestrated the breach. The journals, hidden in a lead-lined chest near the general's vault, remained secure. Lyra was confined to her quarters, placed under the silent, suffocating surveillance of hand-picked Roman guards who spoke no Greek or Gallic. The immediate political crisis was contained, hidden beneath the thick blanket of General Valerius Claudius's absolute control. But the personal fallout was catastrophic. Valerius lost more than just his control. He lost the illusion of his own integrity. He had always defined himself by order and transparency, yet he was now living a deep, complex deception, protecting a traitor because of a sudden, brutal respect for her devotion to a lost cause. He couldn't reconcile the warrior who destroyed the enemy with the man who now protected her truth. He stood over the secured chest containing Vercingetorix's history. If he had been the man he was 6 months ago, he would have had Lyra executed without a second thought. But Lyra had faced him, exposed his weakness, his pride, and spoken the simple truth of duty, a concept he thought only Romans understood. Lucius, the humble baker, was not rewarded. Valerius simply ordered that the baker be transferred, not killed, but exiled from Rome entirely, sent to serve in a distant garrison in Hispania. "Your eyes saw too much truth in Pistor," Valerius told him, handing him a small, heavy purse of silver. "In Rome, such sight is fatal." Lucius accepted the silver, the price of his silence and his separation from Ilara. The price of truth was immediate, heartbreaking loss. The general walked away, leaving the heavy chest and the painful silence behind him. The villa was secure, but the foundation of his life, duty over all, Rome before self, had cracked irreversibly. A year passed. Lyra remained Valerius's wife, still confined, still silent in public, but their life was now built on a foundation of brutal honesty. The political alliance stood, maintained by Valerius's fierce reputation, but the emotional cost was undeniable. The general felt the weight of his deception every day. The fear of exposure was a constant, low-grade fever. One cold evening, Valerius walked into Lyra's rooms, not as a warden but as a man seeking counsel. He carried Vercingetorix's heavy journals. "I have read them," he admitted, placing the parchment scrolls on her table. "Your father's account. It is not the savage narrative the Senate demands. It speaks of law, of honor, of the defense of his people." Lyra looked at him, her gaze softer than it had been since the wedding day. "Truth is rarely simple, General. We both served our duties, and both duties demanded sacrifice." "The lie cannot hold forever," Valerius stated, running a weary hand over his face. He knew the journals would be discovered eventually, and the scandal would destroy both of them. Lyra reached across the table, touching the edge of the scroll. "Then do not let Rome write your ending, Valerius." In the dead of night, General Valerius Claudius, the living symbol of Roman unyielding authority, performed an act of profound, quiet treason. He walked alone to the deep furnace in the villa's archive, where old treaties and obsolete maps were disposed of. He took Vercingetorix's journals, the historical proof of Gallic nobility, the spark that could reignite the frontier war, and slowly fed them to the flames. The paper curled and blackened, the script turning to ash. He destroyed the history to save the peace, sacrificing the reputation of his enemy and, in a way, his own legacy of uncompromising obedience to Rome. He chose the quiet human truth over the loud imperial lie. Months later, Lucius, the baker, was still serving in Hispania, now working under a kinder centurion who appreciated his dedication. One morning, Lucius found a small new arrival in the garrison camp. A girl, 5 years old, carrying a woven straw doll and a letter from Rome, sealed not with the general's mark, but simply with a single olive leaf. Ilara had been freed, officially as a distant relative of a deceased soldier, and sent to Lucius with enough gold to secure their life outside the harsh grip of the capital. Lucius knelt, burying his face in Ilara's thin hair, weeping with relief. He had lost his place in Rome, but gained his future. Back in Rome, Valerius and Lyra stood together, watching a distant parade. The physical distance between them had lessened. Lyra was no longer a symbol of conquest, but a silent partner in their shared secret, a repository of a human truth Valerius now valued above imperial command. He had traded absolute power for a chance at a different kind of honor, one found not in victory, but in protection. He was still the general, but his heart was no longer entirely Rome's. If you enjoyed this story, please remember to like, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more intense Roman tales like this one.